So again, thank you everybody for joining us tonight. We have Russell.Norris and Tyler Davis from Grant Thornton with us to give us an update on the supply chain challenges. Russell is a tax partner in Grant's Charlotte office, has more than 16 years of public accounting experience. He is the National Transportation and Logistics Practice Leader, supporting all three core service lines across the United States. He has extensive experience serving clients in the transport, logistics, and distribution industries through innovative consulting projects and tax reporting. Russell served on tax reform, revenue recognition, accounting methods, technical teams throughout his career. He frequently speaks and writes on these topics and other tax issues in the transport industry. Tyler is a manager in Grant Thornton's sourcing and supply chain practice. He's an experienced consultant with over 10 years of supply chain experience across consulting and industry. Tyler has spent the majority of his consulting career advising multinational and middle market companies achieve positive operational and financial results while positioning the business for future success. He brings a wealth of experience and expertise in process excellence and design, operations, supply chain, data analytics, post-close M&A support, and project management. Prior to consulting, Tyler has held leadership positions in industry, primarily in the transport sector, managing operations and driving strategic initiatives to realize short-term and long-term cost-saving opportunities. So again, I'd like to thank Russell, Tyler for joining us this evening. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. So guys.
And let us know how you would like, if we have any questions, gentlemen, whether you would like that our members to write in the chat box or raise their hand, unmute themselves and ask the question.
Any preferences, guys? How do you?
No preference on my end. However, you guys usually do it. I'm fine with whatever.
Yeah, it's pretty much free form, so we'll free flow. So we'll
that's perfect for us. This can be very informal. Feel free to make it interactive, ask questions, stop us. We do have some stuff that we put together to talk through, but happy to answer questions. So I'll kind of monitor the chat a little bit, Tyler, while you're speaking, and you can do that for me as well. Yeah, perfect. So Mike, thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here speaking with Feng tonight. One of the items that we want to cover is just really recapping and going over some of the different disruptive forces and trends that we're seeing in today's supply chain, especially from the lens of our clients. So there's really, looking over the last 18 months or so, there's really 7 key trends that we're seeing in different disruptive forces. So really the number one is the SKU proliferation and the growing complexity. Time and time again, we've dealt with several different manufacturing clients who went in, pre-COVID as, like customization, having multiple SKUs is kind of like our competitive advantage per se. And now, one of the, key mitigation strategies, which we'll talk about later, is really taking complexity out of the business. And one way to do that is, looking really hard at your SKU portfolio and seeing, okay, are there ways that we can, focus on our core competencies and what we're good at and manufacture maybe, or A, B, some of the C SKUs per se, that's going to in turn help us mitigate some of our supply side challenges and some of our inventory challenges. Number 2 would probably be, the erratic demand, right? COVID, the e-com burst, rise in demand, there's still a lot of pent up demand to be met. And, we're dealing with different challenges still with supplier availability, lead times, congestion at the ports. Number 3 would probably be, rising supply chain cost to serve. And, this isn't just, middle market companies, every company is really dealing with, increasing supply chain cost to serve.
Transportation, warehousing, fulfillment costs tend to, increase with the increase in demand. Inability of suppliers to deliver is number 4. So we're seeing, material shortages impact the market, specifically, those who are in the manufacturing sector. Number 5 and this is one I see a lot, is significant labor shortages. And one that we're also seeing in, of course, the transportation logistics market, right? So, skilled and unskilled labor shortages are still prevalent. And that also falls in with the increase in demand. And just to kind of put into a transportation mindset, looking at the load to truck ratio today, it was 7.3. And to put that in perspective, it's about the same this time last year. And then 2020, we're at 1.84 for the load to truck ratio. So as demand, increases, that labor shortage is also, showing a significant shortage as the demand increases. So number 6 would probably be increased M&A activity. Deal flow is way up. Companies that did have strong supply chains out of the pandemic with stronger balance sheets are looking for strategic investments and tuck-ins. And then lastly, one other one we're seeing is the demand for digital supply chain solutions. So there's increased automation. You'll hear about AI. You'll hear about machine learning, Industry 4.0 capabilities that may have not been at the top of the list, but are becoming more prevalent each day, just because, the need to collaborate across the supply chain is becoming more and more important. So, one thing, to consider with all these different trends and disruptions is really, a few key themes. And I would say one of the most important one is, how do we take complexity out of the business, right? So what are some of the, key leaders, executives doing in today's market that we see with our clients? And, increasing shareholder value and looking at different value drivers, there's really 4 things that they're trying to do. And that's, revenue growth, looking at operating margin, asset efficiency, working capital, right? So with that said, there's, to kind of highlight some of the actions that we're seeing leaders, recalibrate supply chain strategy, focusing on stability, rationalizing underperforming SKUs like we had talked about earlier, right? So focusing on ones where you have a favorable margin, quantifying supply chain costs, looking at different order fulfillment methods, looking at make versus buy, right? So how can you augment, especially in the manufacturing sector again, like how can you augment with external capacity? Looking at your operational gaps. So process is absolutely key, even before COVID, right? So looking at the interconnectivity between different business units and functions. Addressing the labor constraints is absolutely huge. Like I mentioned earlier, a lot of companies are taking a different approach to improving their retention practices, relying on more temporary staff, looking at their recruiting practices, looking at also augmenting, like I said a little bit earlier, looking at, temporary or contingent staff type solutions. It kind of with like the going into like more of the technology piece too. So, there's a lot of clients that are looking at, okay, how do I best optimize our current logistics network based on what our strategy is and the customer needs, how we integrate demand and supply side planning, other ways of looking at, category management, and then supply chain risk management is absolutely key in today's environment. So different, failure modes, managing supply chain risk, looking at continuity planning framework and, really looking to accelerate investments in digital capabilities and automation. So there's certainly a lot going on, and there's an abundance of different strategies and methods to combat that. It's funny. I get asked the question all the time. When is supply chain disruption going to come to an end, or when are we going to see the light at the end of the tunnel? And some people say, hey, it could be 2 years. Some say it could be 4. I think there's really no silver bullet or really no clear answer as to when we're going to see the end of it. But what I can tell you is there's definitely a ton of different strategies, different approaches to mitigate those risks and really overcome that and build some supply chain resiliency.
Tyler, you mentioned digital supply chain solutions. That seems to be a common or a much larger issue than really we hear. And I think about a retailer, for instance. They don't have the visibility of the entire transit, where their cargo is throughout each leg. And I think even within the chain itself, the providers don't have that visibility. Are you seeing improvements in that? Are you seeing any collaboration between the terminals, the ocean carriers, the truckers?
I'm seeing a little bit, not as much as I'd like to see. I think there's some companies, and it depends on what your I guess your data maturity level is, right? And what kind of internal capabilities you have with the systems in place. I will say that I have seen some companies that have maybe a lower maturity in data and technology start to look to build API or do EDI with companies. And like a lot of companies have been doing that already, but you'll start to see more and more companies kind of like break through those entry stages of trying to get near real-time data, inventory visibility with their intermediaries or logistics providers. So there's still a lot of room to grow, and certainly with there's a lot more tools in the marketplace, advanced planning and scheduling, things of that nature that are helping companies become more or increase their visibility into their supply chain.
And the freight rates have been so erratic lately. They've dropped.
They certainly have
significantly most recently. And I just read on the ocean side, they're blank sailing again. They're starting that process. So it's, I guess the challenges are here for the rest of the year.
Yeah. The freight market's been interesting to say the least. I've been listening to a lot of talk on, what the driver shortages, right? And obviously with that and, what's happening with Ukraine driving the fuel prices up, it's certainly been a challenge. Of course, that all, flows into kind of that fuel surcharge we're seeing. Comparing, last month, the fuel surcharge based on information I got from that, it's already up 8%, week over week. So it's certainly becoming a complexity for several different businesses.
If I could just
called for a question.
Please, if there's a question, yeah.
Yeah, I'd love, you were just talking about containers. I'd love to get a sense of containers. It sounds like the demand and pricing is coming off of those, and trucking and rail. I've had horrible issues with rail all winter, and then I've got a factory in Canada, and then the CP strike is not helping that at all. And I don't know if you guys are tuned into Europe, but I hear the European auto industry is really hitting the skids because there's a lot of parts made in Ukraine, and there's a lot of trucks being absorbed in the war. And see if you guys have any insights to that, and sort of, does it get better? Does it get worse? And what's the future look like?
Yeah, no, great question.
Kind of the same old.
Yeah, great question. And it's, starting with kind of the rail and, containers, right? So Port of LA, look, they came out with their monthly briefing. They had about a 20% increase year over year, the amount of containers they handled. A lot of it, obviously, because could be chassis shortages, having to dig through so many containers, long truck lines, et cetera. We see where they're trying to make improvements in the infrastructure, and what's going to be interesting to see play out is the infrastructure bill. Looking at that 1.2 trillion infrastructure bill, about 550 of that, at least in the first round of spending, is going towards the port infrastructure, transportation, logistics. From what I'm seeing, we probably won't see any material improvements probably in the next 3 to 4 years until those projects come to fruition. I will say there are some railroads like BNSF that's looking to add intermodal capacity. A few other things, and there's also one thing that came out too this week was Shenzhen, the port in China, where they had another COVID outbreak, and there's some analysts in the market that are saying, okay, the silver lining to that, it's going to allow our ports to catch up. So we'll see how that plays out. There's just still, I hate to say it, there's just still a lot of unknowns that play into the macro environment and the market. But it is good to see companies like BNSF and some other companies that are trying to make some tangible investments and increase their infrastructure even before the bill's released.
And any sense of European logistics?
I don't know too much of what's going on in Europe right now. Russell, I don't know if you have any comment on that.
Yeah, I'll share a little bit. Again, our practice is mostly focused on the U.S. With some of our counterparts over in Europe, but clearly there's a lot of hesitation right now, a lot of uncertainty over there, and very similarly to in the U.S. what we're experiencing with part shortage and supply chain issues and so forth. They're just compounding over there, right? And it's more of the same. I think they tend to have in Europe the COVID shutdowns hit earlier than us, and we're starting to read about the new variant out there and what's coming, right? I think there's a lot of surprise, a lot of hesitation. I think part of the issue too is on the investment side of things. A lot of probably hesitation with investing in the supply chain and so forth right now with everything that's going on in Ukraine and a lot of the uncertainty, fuel cost issues and so forth. So no different than what you guys are reading about on a day-to-day basis. It's also impacting the U.S.
Great, thank you.
So I'll add a little bit, kind of on the transportation logistics side, specifically. Tyler mentioned the supply chain bottlenecks, the ports, and so forth, the backlogs. Will they be able to free up some of that backlog? But if you think about it and you see the issues are really around the lack of enough employees, right, to help. It's creating issues for the port workers, not having enough of those, not having enough drivers to move the cargo, not having enough storage and warehousing space to have places to move the cargo and to free stuff up, right? So continue to read about the ships being outside the port, sitting longer. We've got damaged goods. We've got manufacturers that aren't getting what they expect, either timely or in many cases, there's damages that they just haven't had to deal with historically, right? So it just continues to disrupt the supply chain across the board. this transportation gridlock and infrastructure issues we continue to see. Who knows, when the infrastructure bill went through, a couple months ago, I think there's a lot of good hope there that, we could jump in soon and it could free up some capacity and help with some of these supply chain issues. And now, as we've seen the costs skyrocket, obviously with the inflation issues and really to some extent the inability to get started on some of these processes because of not having everything that we need, how effective is that really going to be, right? A lot of question marks around that, and is it going to help in the short term? And I think there's a lot of concern that 22 is still going to be strong for the industry, but 23 maybe not so much, right? I'm actually at the Truckload Carriers Association conference out in Las Vegas right now, and a lot of discussion about what does 23 look like. Rates are kind of in place for the most part in 22. For the most part over the last 18 months, carriers have been able to name their rate, record profits in many cases, but it's not all good for them, right? They can't get their hands on equipment. They're ordering equipment and they just can't get it in the door. And the manufacturers can't tell them when they're going to have the equipment available, and orders are getting canceled, pricing sky high associated with all of this. And just a lot of uncertainty. So even though these, in many cases, the carriers are sitting on, plenty of cash, record profits, and so forth, the equipment shortage issue is very significant. The driver shortage issue has always been there. Does not look like there's any relief in sight, unfortunately. The American Trucking Association's estimates that the U.S. is about 80,000 drivers short of what is needed to meet current demand. And with high average age of drivers, you continue to see that number increase almost on a daily basis as more folks retiring coming out of COVID, or deciding they just don't want to work full time anymore. Not enough women in the industry. Women only make up about 7% of all drivers in the workforce for over-the-road trucking, and so clearly that's a focus area for them. Is how do we diversify our workforce? How do we get more folks in to help? Significant push for lowering the age for CDL licensure, right? Currently, you have to be 21 to cross state lines and 18 for interstate only. And so a big significant push to how do we safely get younger drivers qualified to help the industry out. And one of the sessions I sat in on this morning was talking about autonomy and, just how close are we? You've seen some pretty significant investors in the industry, some of the larger carriers. They're starting to invest in the autonomous technology. And a lot of these startup companies that are really making significant strides. But, I think it's not a near-term solution for the industry, right, to help with the driver shortage issue. It's there's still a lot of testing and a lot of headway that they're going to have to make before, it's a commonly accepted practice to help alleviate some of those things. So just a lot of moving parts right now, a lot of things that are being considered. Mentioned the lack of equipment and inability to get the equipment in the door. Many carriers don't have enough equipment to handle all the capacity that they have right now. And I think what we've seen happen there, in addition to the lack of equipment and the driver shortage issues, is really significant upticks in M&A activity. And how can we buy drivers? How can we buy equipment from some of these companies that are looking to exit? And try to solve some of our capacity issues that way. So the M&A world, I think partly last year was driven by uncertainty over tax legislation. With the tax legislation piece dying down, I think we expected the M&A activity to die down as we'd enter 22. And I'll tell you, it's just as busy right now as it was in fourth quarter of 21. So a lot of significant work ongoing. And then kind of the last item I'll mention that's top of everybody's mind, especially with everything going on in Ukraine, is the cybersecurity issues and how that's going to impact the supply chain in general. You know, a lot of times companies in this industry, transportation logistics industry, may not be as sophisticated from a technology perspective as you may see from some of the other companies as far as cybersecurity mitigation and so forth. And so we're encouraging folks to really spend a lot of time focused on that area right now. You know, what's not only, you know, do you have proper protections in place? Are you doing everything you can? But what happens if you become a victim of it, right? How's your response efforts and how's that going to impact your ability to pick back up and continue to function on a go forward basis? So those are kind of some of the key points that are being discussed from a transportation logistics perspective. Happy to answer questions and go from there.
You know, what's interesting, you bring up the CDL license. I find this, if you drive intrastate, you can drive an 18-wheel vehicle and you only have to be 18 years old. Once you cross over the state, you now have to be 21 years old. It really discourages, you know, these young folks to choose trucking as a profession. So just, you know, until they change that law, by the time somebody who knows they're not going into college, by 21, they typically know where they're going to go, what trade they'll choose, electrician, a plumber, wherever. And it's really, you know, it's unfortunate because I think that's an easy fix to attract some folks in.
I agree with that completely. Yeah. You know, the industry as a whole is focused on safety, and how do you get those drivers trained so they can do that, right? But considering you can drive across an entire state, but not drive, you know, 5 miles from Charlotte to Rock Hill because you're crossing state lines, it's a crazy rule. So.
We have a question, George, and I encourage anybody, if you have a question, you want to put it out on the chat. I am looking at the chat. I'll relay them. Is there a tipping point when supply chain costs will start driving more manufacturing closer to home? It's a great question. Sort of a reshoring, onshoring. Are we seeing that happen?
Yeah, I'm definitely seeing it happen. Like I said, you know, I'm seeing make versus buy, you know, type strategies come up. You know, I wouldn't say like with a lot of my clients, they're still kind of in the analysis phase per se and trying to really justify the business opportunity behind it. You know, you hear about different things in the news, you know, big companies opening up plants, you know, in the US and whatnot. Certainly from my perspective though, a lot of my clients are still kind of in that, you know, deep analysis phase. And a lot of that is because there's still like a little bit of uncertainty of what's going on. So, you know, some companies, hey, let's go for it. Makes sense. And some companies are like taking more of the kind of conservative approach. Let's, you know, see what our competitors do or other people in the market before we, you know, bite the bullet.
Who did we see that with? Intel most recently, right? You know, it was interesting. I saw I was reading an article in a journal, had it talked about Timberland Boots and where each component of the boot is sourced. And they're all sourced from almost every continent, one component of a boot. And they're shipped, those components are shipped to Thailand, where the boot is assembled and then shipped to, and then the completed boot is then sent back to the, you know, sent to the US for ultimate sale. And from there, it's then redistributed to other countries for sale, the finished product. It's fascinating, the sourcing that, you know, you don't think about it, you know, something as simple as a boot. I mean, how many components are in it?
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting. I have a client that's actually a commercial playground manufacturer, and they sourced a special type of bolt, you know, hardware component from Poland, and you know, to ship that over cross seas and get that over, you know, very, very small component in the grand scheme of things. Of just, guys, you know, this just doesn't make sense. You know, let's look to re-engineer this out. You know, find alternative suppliers, or, you know, look to, you know, use a standard, you know, US bolt, right? So I mentioned SKU rationalization, but there's also, design for manufacturing and assembly type strategies, right? That where you could, take the complexity out.
What about headwinds going into 22, 23? What are you seeing as headwinds to the supply chain challenges we've been facing?
That's a great question. In terms of headwinds, I would say, I think with, we mentioned the infrastructure bill a little while ago. I think, yeah, it's going to take some time because there's different mechanisms and, how the money is released out. And, that takes time, but really this next year is going to have a, core focus on, planning, right? And working with those local institutions or authorities on how that money is used to better, this nation's infrastructure. So I would say, we have that to look forward to, but, there is a big planning effort that comes into play. That way, 3-4 years down the road that we can really benefit from these investments.
Yeah, and another one that I'll add is clearly with the labor shortage issues, right? It's not just the lack of people, but it's the significant increase in compensation costs associated with that. And a lot of folks are afraid to continue to invest because of how far ahead compensation in a lot of different industry verticals has gotten from where it was pre-COVID, right? And so I think there's a lot of concern that if we see an economic drawback, that, how can I compete on a day-to-day basis with the compensation levels that I'm currently required to pay out, right? So clearly there's some headwinds there. Again, most folks think 22 will remain robust for the most part, pending, just how much further this Ukraine-Russia issue progresses. But there's a lot of concern about 23 with rising interest rates and everything else that's going on.
Do you see any issues in the West Coast, the ILWU? The longshoremen on the West Coast, their contract is up in July. You guys getting any? I don't even know if the negotiations have begun yet.
That's an interesting question. I really haven't seen too much come out of that yet. That's kind of just, we'll see what happens with that, renegotiation, but I haven't heard a lot of talk about, what that's going to do or, whatnot. And someone had mentioned, the CN labor strike, right? And how, something like that does really disrupt transportation supply chain. So I'm sure we'll see, some similar effects, more to come once we kind of near the end of those negotiations.
Yeah, there's another couple questions in the chat, monitoring. Happy to take a stab at a few of these. The transportation bill, what will it do anything more than add to port capacity? If no, then it will be 3 to 4 years before we see really relief associated with that. I think that's right. I mean, there's still some to be determined there, but this is not a quick fix by any means, right? From an infrastructure transportation perspective. So, it's how do we progress over the next couple of years and try to mitigate some of these issues as that runway continues. The equipment issue is no different than what we're seeing in the automotive sector, where it's for the most part is not necessarily anything other than the chip shortage, right? That's going in these tractors on the tractor side. On the trailer side, a lot of it is again certain parts and so forth. The issue that carriers are running into is they don't have replacement parts to fix equipment that's breaking down. And so in a lot of cases, they have equipment, but it's not functioning the way it's supposed to, and it's basically parked and sitting idle. And so, the problem is that everybody, even these large carriers that have significant purchasing power, they're not getting the equipment that they want from the OEMs. And that equipment orders are being delayed, they're getting pushed out to different years, and it's making it very, very difficult for carriers to determine the actual capacity they think they'll have on a go-forward basis. And really, that equipment issue is almost as bad, if not worse, than the driver shortage issue right now, just because of the inability to project capacity. With the warehousing issue, I agree completely. I think I touched on this a minute ago. The wage rate issue is significant, and you continually have to pay more and more and more. And at some point, when does that scale tip even worse than where you've been already? So the inflation issues there aren't helping by any means, and that's really across all industries, right? I mean, we're experiencing that in public accounting, where there's such a competition for folks in public accounting, and fewer students coming through the school system and so forth, that pay increases are becoming even more and more necessary. And it's not just annual pay increases, it's pay increases every few months, it seems like, in many industries. So really significant items. And then the information sharing and investment on the software side, we're seeing a ton of investment right now on the technology side. In many cases, it's folks that haven't invested the way they should historically. And how are they using technology to expedite that supply chain process, to identify issues, to work through those issues and so forth. So just a lot of investment in that area for sure right now.
Yeah, I would say, like, with number 4, I completely agree, Russell. I mean, there's still clients that are still in the phases of really developing a data management, data governance strategy to, get an ROI on some of those investments and softwares and technologies. But, there's different, tools out there that's really helping companies with legacy systems or, disparate tools, systems that, may not talk to each other already, where they're taking that data and synthesizing it with different ways and absorbing it to, share across the supply chain. Because like I mentioned earlier, I think collaboration it's absolutely key right now. And the more information sharing that you have, from supplier to customers is what's helping a lot of these companies out.
Hey, I was scrolling back through the questions. Did we get them all answered?
I think we have one more. Here's another one just popped in. I think it's a question or perhaps a comment, but with a question mark. Isn't the biggest headwind or problem the massive overstimulus by the government? Free money and demand outstripped supply. I mean, it really brought, wasn't this entire supply chain issue driven by demand, or what would you say it was not driven by?
Yeah, great comment and question. I think nobody knew.
Tough one to answer.
Yeah, nobody knew 2 years ago what was going to happen, right? I mean, I remember the internal discussions that we had at Grant Thornton, and we're going to close the office for a couple weeks, and I remember saying, okay, this may last 10 days, 2 weeks, whatever. I don't need to take my second monitor home and so forth. And about a day later, I went back to the office and got it, because I said, there's no end in sight, right? And with the government starting the stimulus to try to keep folks going, you're right. I mean, in a lot of cases, that we pushed so hard and so fast that a lot of the money maybe didn't end up where it really needed to be to help throughout that process, right? And so money and demand changed. The e-commerce clearly has changed significantly, and I think those are great comments. Agree completely.
Any other questions?
Mike, Anant here. I'd like to kind of add to what Jeff just asked, Russell and Tyler, if that's okay.
Please.
Okay, appreciate you. So I know the Fed is going to try to get a handle on inflation. I know the government tried their best to avoid a complete halt in the economic activity in the United States. And to some extent, the US drives the rest of the world as well. They poured a massive amount of money into the system. The Fed's going to do what they can, but there are certain behaviors that are unalterably changed. And in your mind, what issues are going to remain as far as the landscape that we see from a supply chain standpoint, and what issues in yours mind are going to be fixed? Thank you.
What you think, Tyler?
Yeah. So, I would say for really problems that are going to remain, I think obviously the demand, there's still a lot of pent up demand in the marketplace. Labor shortages, I'm hoping, those will curb in the next year or so. A lot of companies are really making investments in tackling attrition and looking at different ways to mitigate turnover and retention. I would say we're still going to have some issues with congestion at the ports, we'll see what happens 3 to 5 years on this horizon with the infrastructure bill. Those are kind of where I see problems still residing. Russell, how about you?
Yeah, I think clearly the labor issues that we've talked about are not going to go away between the cost that we've talked about, the shortage that we've talked about, fewer qualified folks, fewer folks coming out of the college ranks for certain jobs and certain industries. And, and quite honestly, a lot of folks that have enjoyed being at home and don't want to go back to an in the office or day-to-day job. They want flexibility. They want more part-time schedules. They may not want to leave the house. They may not want to drive across the country anymore, whatever it is, just those challenges I don't think are going to be fixed anytime in the near term. And so then I think the question becomes, just how quickly does the economic side of things slow down, right? And some of the moves that the Fed is making, what's the impact on that in the near term, and how does that impact long term, right? I think what we've seen is a lot of folks that have gone to either part-time roles or maybe even retired early coming out of the pandemic are now kind of scratching their heads a little bit and saying, man, did I do this too early, right? And how do I get back in? And so you're kind of seeing it flip the other way a little bit as well. So just a lot of uncertainty out there as to which direction it's going to head.
Yeah, it's interesting, like especially, you had mentioned the drivers earlier, and there's this school of thought that some people believe, oh, it's the low wages and poor working conditions. Well, that's not necessarily the case. I mean, you got to think about supply and demand, right? And I know, like I mentioned, there's several companies going through great lengths to try and reduce the attrition. I'm starting to see like a new narrative kind of come out in the last month or so, where you can make a great career as a driver. Yeah, it does take like a special individual with the younger generation, especially where they might aspire a work-life balance. But in doing some research and listening to some people speak from driving schools, they're starting to really they're starting to focus more time and attention and matching this younger generation of drivers to companies where they share the same values. So where they can pick their own routes or their own hours, or something where, okay, yeah, we do have a work-life balance.
Either Russell or I forget your name.
Russell and Tyler.
Tyler, yeah. Have you found with your clients that they're trying to create a digital solution within 12 months or less? In other words, a digital solution, AI, whatever you want to call it, the cloud, this is a long-term cultural change. How do we operate? But are you finding that people are doing this in the effort to fix what is a problem that will continue? In other words, are you finding that your clients are creating more of a mess by introducing a digital solution and trying to shove in a solution with an 18-month period? I'm not sure if that carries, if you understand my question.
Yeah, no, that's such a good question. I've seen it. Yeah, I've seen it a couple times where we've had clients, rush into a digital solution without really understanding all the requirements. Yeah, I think it's important to come up with a solution in the immediate term and be able to react to the current supply chain conditions, but you also don't want to run into a situation where, hey, we messed up and we're gonna have to spend more money to fix this problem that we created. It just takes careful planning, really understanding the requirements and understanding how the macroeconomic forces play into the grand scheme of things, especially with the business. I will say, I've had one interesting story where a client is looking to improve their inventory management capabilities. And in doing so, the software was ready, they were ready to implement, but they couldn't get RF scanners, the RF guns in time because there was a 6-month lead time to get the RF guns. Just, crazy, like little things like that I'm seeing that you wouldn't, typically expect.
Thanks.
We have a question. We touched on it a little earlier, but of the $1.2 trillion bill, the infrastructure bill, the portion dedicated to infrastructure, is it acceptable? Is it going to create in the long term a recovery? Are we going to recover? Is it going to be effective, I suppose, is the best way? Is it enough?
Yeah, I think it's clearly not enough. I think it's what we have right now. Right, but the infrastructure issues are significant, right? Deterioration of bridges and roadways and so forth, and to some extent it varies state to state. But clearly, 40% of that price tag is not going to fix a significant amount of the issues that are out there, right? And so, is this a stepping stone where we can get more funding and more improvement to infrastructure, or is this really going to be a Band-Aid, right? I mean, I think that's the challenge, especially with the rising costs and how much less we can do with those funds than maybe what we thought we could a few months ago. So a lot of moving parts there, but a long way to go to get where we need to be.
I think the only port or terminal rather that was set up in the last 20 years was in Charleston, most recently, the only one.
Yeah.
The ships are getting bigger and bigger coming in the West Coast, right? 10, 15 years ago, what was this, 13,000, 15,000 Ts? Mm-hmm. Now they're 20,000, even larger that are coming up, and the infrastructure, the hasn't changed. The cranes are larger, they're accommodating them. Even the cranes on the East Coast are bigger to accommodate the larger ships to go through the Panama Canal now. But the number of terminals, it's stuck. Any other questions? This was a great discussion, guys. Thank you.
Hi, Bob Ganser.
Hey, Bob.
I reside in Wilmington, North Carolina, and the port city is certainly has done some amazing capital improvements. down to dredging the Cape Fear River for larger ships. But it's a long-term effect. It's a long-term issue because they're trying to connect with Rocky Mount through railways. And they have brought in new equipment. They have set up the terminals in a more efficient way. But you're right, they don't have enough drivers. And I know the director of that operations, and yeah, you're correct on that. The driver issue is really the problem because they have plenty of chassis and trucks, but they don't have enough drivers. And that's why they're trying to improve the railways to get more into the central section of North Carolina. And I think that's another couple of years before they have all the results in. Okay.
Great.
Yeah,
Good
that's a good
observation.
point.
I have another question that just came in. We hear a lot about uncertainty as a manufacturer. It all about addressing complexity, keeping it real simple for our labor force, new operators to run equipment, etc. Is this a question? Companies must take this time to optimize its operations, SKU and customer rationalization, reestablish terms and pricing with customers and suppliers. Timing is now to eliminate unproductive systems, activities, etc. That's a good point.
Yeah, I think that really falls into, some of the portfolio rationalization pieces that we talked about earlier. But, brings up a great point about keeping it simple for the labor force. One thing that we're seeing manufacturers do is creating standard work and taking it to a level to where, you reduce your training costs, taking it to a level where someone can come in and easily learn how to operate the machine or, perform a certain process. So, with the supply chain disruption, there's some critics lean inventory. It's probably not the best strategy right now. We need, inventory as a good buffer, but there's still some principles that apply, like, standardization, standard work, making it easy for the next guy to come in.
Yeah. How many times have we heard during the past 2 years, just in time has become just in case, right? It's sort of cliche now, isn't it?
Yep.
Just one more general question for Russell and Tyler. As someone mentioned earlier about Intel, they're investing an extraordinary amount of money to develop chips in the United States, and now recently understanding that Germany is going to be another source. What happens if things become normal? What happens if the demand supply are in check? Are we going to find Intel, I won't use the politically correct tail in, I forget what the term is, but is it lack of composure, or is this a reaction? Because in 2 or 3 years, we'll know whether that decision was the right one. And you're talking an extraordinary amount of money being dropped to create chips. Do you have any thoughts? Have your clients asked you for recommendations or solutions, or do you think that what Intel is doing is correct? Because there's a pretty big risk, in my opinion. Any thoughts?
Russell, you want to take this one?
Yeah, I think that right now people are looking at it in the short term, right? And how's it going to alleviate the short term issues? I'm hearing less and less discussion about the longer term aspects. Those are really good questions that you're asking, right? And because the upfront investment that's coming in, right, to make all that happen. So I think clearly it's a response to the ongoing issues. But you've got to balance that the near term needs with longer term perspectives, right?
Yeah, that investment won't materialize until 3 to 4 years.
That's right.
So we're basically guessing that the demand's going to be through the roof,
Mhm.
and all that money is going to, yeah, okay.
Agreed.
We're coming up on the half hour, so why don't we just make this one last question I have in the chat. How are ESG initiatives shaping industry response to the challenges in the landscape? Are they helping or hurting?
Yeah, great question. I think what we've seen, and I'll kind of refer to some of the public trucking companies out there, and you're starting to read about, some are actually including disclosures in some of their financial information. The SEC is currently discussing, and I think it may have been today, and I haven't seen what the outcome of it was, is when they may start requiring more robust disclosures around ESG in the financial statements. But this is the topic on all of our C-suite's minds, right? Is how do we respond to the ESG initiatives? Are we doing the things that will allow us to report on that information? What do we need to do to be able to report on that information? And some of it's clearly responding to these challenges in the industry. And it's not, a lot of it's on the sustainability aspects of it and the governance aspects, right? And from a diversity perspective, it's not just environmental, right? And so just hearing a lot of discussion around this, and I think it's really making folks take a step back and say, okay, what should we really be doing to respond to some of these challenges, which I think is helpful dialogue.